Immigration. Is it good or bad for America? And is it the source of our most pressing problems? You're about to find out. Hi, I'm Todd, and this is the On Wealth and Progress podcast. In my recent posts on the way forward, I've discussed the long series of events beginning with the Vietnam War that shook America's foreign policy competence. Recently, the nightly news has been filled with images of police lines and protesters in Los Angeles that make it feel as if, 60 years after Vietnam, we've come full circle. In a recent interview, Wall Street Journal reporter Michelle Hackman noted that the ICE raids in Los Angeles were driven in large part by U.S. Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller's belief that immigration is uniquely at the center of our current problems. As Hackman also noted, other conservative commentators have gone so far as to recommend that we totally shut down all immigration for a period of time. While I support the Trump administration's efforts to secure the border, to remove violent criminals who are here illegally with due process, and to protect the peace, property, and safety of law-abiding citizens and law enforcement, it's critically important to understand that immigration is not the central cause of our most pressing problems. In fact, far from it. As we'll see in this post, we do have significant issues to deal with, but they are not due to immigration. Rather, our most pressing problems are a direct result of trying to absorb the impoverished workforces resulting from the failure of communism and of our own self-inflicted policy mistakes. But before we get into these more recent issues, let's begin by taking a look at our experience when it was at its all-time high. Peak immigration, the limited government era. Throughout the 19th century and up until the Great Depression of the 1930s, the federal government played a minimal role in economic matters. Monetary policy was restricted by the gold standard, which limited the government's ability to print money and kept inflation at bay. Both Democrats and Republicans were committed to holding federal spending and revenue collections to minimal levels and to operating with balanced budgets and minimal debt. Excluding the major wars, federal spending averaged about 2.5% of GDP during this time. In comparison, this is a little over 1/10 of current levels of spending. In addition, the federal government ran peacetime surpluses throughout the limited government era, and federal debts were typically held below 5% of GDP, which afforded ample borrowing capacity for emergencies like wars. During this limited government era, America experienced its largest wave of immigration. Our population in the mid-1860s was less than 40 million. Nevertheless, from the aftermath of the Civil War to the onset of World War I, the U.S. welcomed over 25 million immigrants to the country. In other words, immigration was over 50% of the beginning population base during this period. Nevertheless, the economy also experienced extraordinary growth during this time, with real GDP increasing about 4% annually from 1866 to 1913. This high rate of growth was in line with the overall peacetime growth that occurred throughout the limited government era as a whole, and importantly, living standards for all Americans increased dramatically throughout this period. Suffice to say, the massive levels of immigration during the limited government era was mutually beneficial for both those escaping deprivation abroad. If not, why else would they have kept coming in such large numbers over an extended period? And for the country as a whole. To summarize and compare, during the period between the Civil War and World War I, the U.S. economy absorbed wave after wave of immigration, which collectively represented more than 50% of the beginning population base, while growing at the extraordinary rate of 4% a year. Now, more recently, from 2001 to 2019, i.e. from just after the recession that followed the collapse of the tech stock bubble to just prior to the COVID shutdowns, we experienced legal and illegal immigration of less than 10% of our beginning population, but grew at an anemic rate of just 2.2% a year. In other words, we have a growth problem that is not a result of immigration. So if immigration wasn't the cause of this growth problem and our other most pressing issues, what was? Let's take a very short break, and then I'll be back with the answers. Okay, we've just seen that immigration is not the core problem with our growth issues, that in fact when we had our highest waves of immigration, we also experienced the highest growth in the country's history, which was during the long limited government era. So now, let's look at the central causes of our most pressing issues and current challenges. Today, our most pressing issues are, as we just discussed, a lack of growth and upward mobility for working class Americans, our dangerous debts and budget deficits, and our new Cold War with China's Communist Party, or the CCP. The real driving causes of these challenges are the failure of communism and a long string of self-inflicted policy mistakes. Let's begin with the failure of communism. If China had been a small country, or if communism had been even modestly successful, the impact of absorbing their labor into Western-based economies would not have been so onerous. But in 1991, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, China's population was almost 1.2 billion, which was nearly double the combined population of 630 million people living in the United States and Western Europe. At the same time, per capita GDP in China was only 1.5% of that in the Western economies. Trying to absorb a country of this magnitude with living standards and wage expectations so far below ours was a bit like trying to climb Mount Everest with an oxygen-inhibiting mask over our face. Compared to the Everest-like challenge of integrating over 1 billion impoverished people into our markets, absorbing both legal and illegal immigrants into our system has been like stepping over a molehill. While precise numbers are hard to come by, the high end of the range of estimated immigrants coming into the United States between 2001 and 2024 is around 35 million, which is less than 3% of China's population at the beginning of the period. In addition, the majority of immigration to the United States during this time was legal, and many of these immigrants have played leading roles in forming companies that have created vast numbers of high-paying jobs. And the balance of the legal immigrants were absorbed into our system under U.S. wage scales, as opposed to wages in China, which even today are a fraction of ours. Taking all these factors into consideration, it is almost certain that immigration has had a very positive impact on our economic and working conditions. By contrast, The increase in our trade deficit in goods with China over the past few decades tells us that trying to absorb China's low-wage workforce has had a profound impact on American labor. Now, in addition to all of this, our efforts to bring China into our market-based system has also funded the resurgence of the Chinese Communist Party from its near-death experience in the late 20th century. In fact, our trade with China has helped push their GDP up from around 6% of ours when the Soviet Union collapsed to over 60% today, making China by far and away our largest threat in the world. In comparison, Russia's GDP is only about 1/10 the size of China's today. So to summarize, taking both the economic effect and the threat to our peace and security into account, immigration is but a molehill compared to the Everest-like impact of the failure of communism and the resurgence of the Chinese Communist Party that resulted from our efforts to absorb their impoverished workforce into our system. Let's take another real brief break right here, and then I'll come back and talk about the self-inflicted policy mistakes that have also been at the core of our current most pressing issues. Policy mistakes. In addition to the failure of communism, during the past 2 decades, we have also committed a long series of policy mistakes that transformed our system from high growth, safe debts, and budgetary surpluses to anemic growth, highly dangerous debts, and deficits. Let's briefly review how these mistakes have culminated in the problems that we're dealing with today. As globalization took off in the 1990s, the Federal Reserve and Treasury engaged in a series of bailouts designed to minimize the impact of a number of potential financial crises. These bailouts culminated with the stealth bailout of long-term capital management in 1997. The Fed's interest rate cuts following these actions helped send already buoyant tech stocks into the stratosphere, which then led to the historic collapse of the tech stock bubble in early 2000. As I've covered in my book, the Fed responded to the collapse of the tech stock bubble with historic reductions in short-term interest rates to try and cushion the economy from the potential economic impact of the collapsing stock prices. Coming in the midst of already elevated housing appreciation that had been previously triggered by the government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, these rate cuts led to a tsunami of home purchases financed with variable rate loans. When the Fed finally started normalizing interest rates in 2006, home appreciation decelerated and then prices collapsed, which led us into the Great Financial Crisis and then the Great Recession. Now, the Great Recession ended within months after Barack Obama took office. Nevertheless, his administration tried to jumpstart the economy by implementing historic peacetime deficit spending. But all we got in return was continued anemic growth and dangerous borrowings that pushed the federal debt from slightly below 40% to over 75%. In other words, this misguided spending pushed debt from the high end of what I'd call the safe zone to the low end of the danger zone, which left little room for a real emergency like a war or a global pandemic. When COVID-19 turned the lights off in America's and the world's workplaces, the Trump administration responded with heavy spending. While perhaps more than was needed, At the time, it was impossible to know how long the world's factories and office buildings and stores would remain in the dark. If not for the unproductive spending blowout during Obama's first term, our debt levels would have increased, but not into the dangerous levels that they are now. As it was, COVID spending pushed debt up to nearly 100% of GDP. Now, when Joe Biden took office after Trump in early 2021, the economy was already several months into a recovery from the COVID downturn. Nevertheless, in his first year in office, the Biden administration actually broke Obama's record for peacetime deficit spending, which led to the worst bout of inflation since the 1970s. Added to all of this, a long bipartisan lack of spending discipline that has stretched from George Bush to Barack Obama to Joe Biden pushed even non-emergency spending well above historic norms. And this has left us with chronic and dangerous deficits of over 6% a year. To summarize, our most pressing problems today include a new Cold War with a resurgent Communist Party in China, the need to reinvigorate upward mobility for working class Americans, and dangerous debts and deficits. None of these problems resulted from immigration, and all of them are a direct result of the impoverishment caused by communism and a long string of failed government interventions and spending policies. Now let's take one last short break, and then we'll come back with some concluding remarks about the LA ICE protests. The LA immigration protests. The ICE protests out in Los Angeles started on Friday, June 6th, in reaction to a number of immigration raids around the city. And these protests involved some attacks on law enforcement agents and property. When the attacks continued on Saturday, the president called in the National Guard, which arrived Sunday morning. Acts of violence continued on Sunday, but then diminished the following day, and with a few exceptions, protests remained mostly peaceful during the following week. As the week went on, President Trump announced a change in guidance that will refocus ICE's efforts on, to quote, getting the criminals out of the United States. So a few observations about these events. The administration's decision to set quotas for ICE was an enormous mistake, one that creates adverse incentives to act indiscriminately and overstep appropriate boundaries. At the same time, California Governor Gavin Newsom's inflammatory response to Trump calling in the National Guard was also a mistake that had the potential to further inflame the protesters. In light of the reduced violence that began the day after the National Guard arrived, Newsom's predictions appear unfounded and shows that Trump's decision was nowhere near as reckless as Newsom tried to portray it. Fortunately, amidst all of this, local law enforcement, the National Guard and the Marines, and the vast majority of protesters all appear to have handled matters with remarkable restraint, which has contributed greatly to lessening of tensions. The administration has already scored a big victory at the border, refocusing on finding and, after appropriate due process, deporting criminals should help further de-escalate matters. Most importantly, as we've covered in this podcast, we must recognize the enormous contributions made by our immigrant communities and dispel any notion that legal immigration is a key cause of our most pressing issues. If we can reignite the type of economic growth we've experienced in the past, we will provide upward mobility for Americans and the resulting demand for additional labor that will help keep the door open for the millions who dream of coming to America to work hard and create a better life for their families. Today we face important challenges, but none that are greater than those we have overcome time and again throughout our storied history. Here is to hoping your day is as bright as America's future. Thanks for listening in. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to my website, toddsheetswriter.com, where you'll find links to my book and to my newsletter, On Wealth and Progress newsletter, which is available free of charge on Substack. Thanks again. Have a great day.